So it turns out this week we get to enjoy a moment in revisionist history. Parshat Devarim, this week's Torah portion, begins the book of Deuteronomy, in which Moses gathers his fellow Israelites to recount their journeys from Egypt to Sinai and then through the wilderness. But as he shares the history of their journeys, Moses amends the tale of their travels, suggesting that at one point the Israelites had become so numerous and uncooperative that he had to instruct them to choose chieftains to settle their disputes. How can I bear unaided the trouble of you, the burden and the bickering? Pick from each of your tribes judges who are wise, discerning, and experienced, and I will appoint them as your leaders. Unfortunately, Moses, who is referencing events that transpire shortly after the Hebrews escaped from Egypt, leaves out a few key details in his summary. In the original telling of the tale, it's not Moses who complains about the burden placed upon his shoulders, but rather his father-in-law, Jethro. And Jethro shows genuine concern, not just for the plight of Moses, but also for the plight of the Israelites. By making himself the center of every inquiry and debate, Moses had created as maddening and inefficient a system for addressing the needs of the Jewish people as the U.S. Post Office. Only Jethro's intervention enables Moses to finally see what's going on and save himself and his people from his folly. And so now we have two stories. In the Exodus version of this story, Moses learns valuable lessons about leadership, responsibility, and work-life balance. In the Deuteronomy version of this story, however, Moses presents a stiff rebuke of the Israelites with no acknowledgement of his own responsibility for the events that transpired. Of course, the contexts for these two versions are completely different. The Exodus version purports to tell us events as they happened, while the Deuteronomic version purports to retell Moses' sermon to the Israelites before they depart for the Promised Land without him. So maybe Moses is changing the story in order to teach the Israelites a valuable lesson while the one time he has them around. Maybe Moses is revealing a little bit of resentment that he doesn't get to go into the Promised Land too. Or maybe Moses has just gotten grumpy as he's gotten older. But regardless of his motives, Moses employs a very dangerous technique. He rewrites history with little or no concern for the facts, and he rewrites it in a way that fits his needs. Now, to be fair, rewriting history is kind of inescapable in practice. We constantly alter our historical records based upon newly available evidence brought to us by scientific advancements, archaeological discoveries, and social changes. Our understanding of events that happened today might change by tomorrow through no fault of our own. But there are other times when we change the story, not because we've discovered some new information that changes our point of view, but because the story as is doesn't fit our wants or desires. And that type of change can be very dangerous, not just because it smacks of dishonesty, but because so often our motivation for changing history is to assign guilt for something we find distasteful. How often do we change the details of a story so we can conveniently blame someone else for our own shortcomings? We were late because of the traffic. We didn't follow the instructions because they were unclear. Now, these examples are innocent enough because the faceless victims of our slightly too tall tales typically don't have to suffer the consequences of our revisions. But what if they did? What if the drivers on every car on the road with us were punished for making us late, even though we should have just left earlier? What if the Israelites had suffered for their alleged abuse of Moses, even though, according to Exodus, it never really happened? Unfortunately, as Jews, we kind of know the answer. We don't have to think too hard about what happens when people revise history to find a scapegoat. Too many of our ancestors fell prey to revisionist liberties taken by the Gospel of Matthew, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, the Dearborn Independent, insert your favorite dishonest anti-Semitic screed wherever you like. I mean, it's kind of a long list. Take, for example, the story of William. At 12 years old, William had already established himself as a dutiful young man about town. In order to help sustain his family, he had taken an apprenticeship with the local tanner in his hometown of Norwich, England. During one of his daily errands, he met a man working as a cook for the Archdeacon of Norwich, and the cook offered 3 shillings to William's mother if she would permit the young man to serve in the kitchens. William began his work on a Tuesday. On Saturday, he was found dead in the woods north of Norwich, the victim of multiple stab wounds. The crime remained unsolved. The year was 1144 in the Common Era. 6 years later, around 1150, an historian named Thomas arrived to chronicle the death of the young boy. Hoping to craft a history that would lead to William's canonization as a saint, Thomas interviewed surviving character witnesses and several Jewish converts to Christianity. This is the tale he told. Each year, according to Thomas the historian, Jewish leaders throughout the world met in the small town of Narbonne, France. There, they chose a community to sacrifice a young Christian child, part of an annual ritual conducted by the Jews in order to ensure their return to Israel. In 1144, the Jews of Norwich were chosen for the task. Thomas then suggested that the cook, who had never been identified, was a hireling tasked with enticing William into a Jewish home, where the boy was bound, gagged, crucified, and tortured before Norwich's Jews dumped him ceremoniously in the woods. Now, Thomas's riveting tale never succeeded in canonizing the young William as a saint, but it did succeed at something. It succeeded at inspiring his fellow Christians to hold the Jewish people responsible for virtually every unsolved death of a Christian child in Europe for the next 500 years. And countless innocent Jews died because of violence or execution associated with these baseless charges, which came to be known as blood libels. Again, to be fair, Thomas's account was written about 1,000 years ago, and Moses nearly 2,000 years before that. Could it be that the development of human civilization has enabled us to transcend the dangerous practice of rewriting history for the purposes of scapegoating others? I wish it were so, but history doesn't seem to agree. Just this past Wednesday, in fact, the President of the United States delivered a surprising message to his Twitter followers, suggesting that transgender individuals would no longer be allowed to serve in the United States military because our military must be focused on decisive and overwhelming victory and cannot be burdened with the tremendous medical costs and disruption that transgender in the military would entail. Now, never mind the gross misestimation of costs involved in providing medical care for transgender soldiers, which, according to a study commissioned by the RAND Corporation on behalf of the government, costs less than 3 presidential weekend trips to Mar-a-Lago or the military budget for Viagra prescriptions, depending on the currency you prefer. What the president suggests in his tweet is that our military could effectively focus on decisive and overwhelming wartime victories if only those darn transgender soldiers would wouldn't get in the way. Now, having been to both of the wars we're currently fighting, I can personally guarantee that the presence of patriotic, volunteer, transgender soldiers is not what's holding us back from decisive victory. Now, I'd like to add a disclaimer. Friends, we don't like to talk about politics at Temple. I don't like to talk about politics at Temple. And the reason we don't like to talk about politics as Temple is because we know that there are any number of perfectly different, perfectly legitimate ways to govern our society. And we want this place to be a home for people who subscribe to every different approach to policymaking. Democrat or Republican, conservative or liberal or independent, we expect our congregation and our clergy to keep an open mind to the politics of everyone who walks through these doors. But that doesn't mean that we should keep an open mind to bigotry or intolerance or chauvinism. Condemning the president's comments on Wednesday isn't a matter of politics. It's a matter of human decency. And if we cannot permit Judaism to speak to matters of human decency simply because it makes our politics uncomfortable, then we've allowed our politics to define our Judaism instead of allowing our Judaism to define our politics. And that would be just another instance of revising history to suit our needs. We've been given a grave responsibility. Each time we open our mouths, we possess the power to create or to destroy. When we tell the story of our lives, when we share our insights about the world, we're writing history. And it is our sacred obligation to make sure that we write it with integrity and accountability so that no one need become the victims of our story. This obligation demands that we speak honestly and honorably, but it also demands that we require the same from others. By so doing, we'll create a world that honors all our stories. May this be God's will for us, for this august community, and for this great nation. Shabbat Shalom.